You think you understand what slavery was? You've heard about the transatlantic slave trade, watched the documentaries, felt the horror you're supposed to feel. But what if I told you that was just one chapter in a much longer, far darker story? Imagine a slave trade that didn't last for centuries, but for over a millennium. One that didn't just steal people. It annihilated cultures, wiped ancient languages off the map, and reduced entire populations to data points in a brutal economic machine. This wasn't just oppression, it was civilizational erasure, calculated and relentless. Today, we're uncovering a historical horror so vast and buried that it rarely makes it into textbooks. Not because it's irrelevant, but because it's too explosive to teach. According to Ottoman archives dating from the 14th century, according to medieval Islamic legal texts from as early as the 7th century, what I'm about to share with you represents the most comprehensive system of human subjugation ever devised. We're talking about documented evidence from multiple empires spanning from the 7th century expansion of the Arab conquests all the way to the 20th century. Primary sources that historians have verified but mainstream education ignores. Makes you wonder what else they're not telling you, doesn't it? Buckle up, because this journey through suppressed history is about to completely reshape how you see the past. Let's start with every parent's worst nightmare made into actual government policy. You know how modern parents lose their minds when their kid doesn't text back for an hour? Imagine if tomorrow government officials knocked on your door and demanded your 12-year-old son, not for school, not for camp, forever. And here's the kicker. You'd never see him again, except maybe when he returned 20 years later as one of the soldiers collecting the next generation of children. This happened to Christian families across the Balkans for over 600 years. But wait, it gets worse. And here's the really twisted part. Some of these stolen children would return as the soldiers who collected the next generation, pointing Ottoman rifles at the parents who once tucked them into bed. Picture this scene from a Serbian village in 1515. The church bells start ringing, not for Sunday service, but as a warning. Ottoman officials have arrived with their soldiers, and every Christian family knows what's coming. Boys aged 8 to 18 are dragged from their homes and lined up in the village square like cattle at market. The officials walk down the line checking teeth, measuring height, testing reflexes. They're looking for the best specimens, the healthiest, strongest, most intelligent boys. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't random brutality. This was a calculated system with actual selection criteria written down in bureaucratic manuals. One mother, according to Ottoman records, fell to her knees begging, offering everything her family owned: their house, their animals, their land. The official's response: he laughed and said her son was worth more than her entire village. Another father tried to bribe the collectors with gold he'd hidden for 20 years. When that failed, he attacked the soldiers with his bare hands. They beat him unconscious in front of his son. The boy, maybe 13 years old, watched his father's blood pool in the dirt, knowing he'd never see him again. The truly disturbing part: this scene repeated itself in thousands of villages across the Balkans, year after year, generation after generation. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Let me tell you about Sakolu Mehmed Pasha, born Sokolovic to a Serbian Orthodox family, taken at age 10 from his village near Visegrad. His mother tried to give him a piece of bread for the journey, but the soldiers knocked it from her hands. Fast forward 40 years, and this stolen child has become the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the second most powerful man in the known world. And what does he do with this power? He orders military campaigns against his own homeland. He literally commanded the armies that would raid Serbian villages, just like his own, stealing boys just like he had been stolen. The psychological complexity here is staggering. Imagine being so thoroughly reprogrammed that you'd wage war on your own people. Speaking of psychological complexity, Sakolu did build a bridge in his hometown, the famous bridge on the Drina. Some historians see this as a sign he remembered his origins, but the reality is darker. The bridge allowed Ottoman armies to more easily invade Serbian lands. Even his gift to his birthplace was a tool of conquest. Makes our modern identity crisis look pretty simple, doesn't it? The village of Guye Podinje tells an even more devastating story. In 1463, Ottoman collectors took every single boy between 8 and 18. Every single one. The demographic destruction was immediate and catastrophic. Without young men, the fields went unplowed. Without sons to inherit, family lines ended. The women and elderly tried to maintain the village, but it was mathematically impossible. Within one generation, just 25 years, the village was abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows sudden depopulation, houses left with possessions inside, tools abandoned in fields, churches that simply stopped being maintained, an entire community erased, not by plague or war, but by stealing its children. Ottoman records, which they kept meticulously because bureaucracy was apparently very important, even when stealing children, provide heartbreaking testimonies from parents. One father wrote, "They took my Marco when he had just learned to help with the harvest. His mother never spoke again. She lived 10 more years but never said another word." Another account describes a mother who went mad with grief. She would set a place at the table for her son every night for 30 years, talking to the empty chair as if he might walk through the door. The truly disturbing part is that these weren't considered tragedies by the collectors. They were considered normal operating procedures. Here's what most people don't realize about the selection process. Officials looked for specific qualities that would make good soldiers and administrators. Intelligence was prized. They'd test boys with puzzles and questions. Physical perfection was essential. Any defect meant rejection. They even checked family histories for hereditary diseases. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic scientific selection. They were breeding a warrior class from stolen children, and they'd perfected the process over centuries. The origins of this system date back to the 14th century, supposedly as a temporary measure during conquest. But like many government programs, temporary became permanent. Under Murad I, the Devsh was codified into law. The legal justification came from Islamic jurisprudence that allowed taking non-Muslim children as compensation for the protection the empire provided. Protection from what? From the empire itself. Apparently, the circular logic would be almost funny if it weren't so horrific. Historians estimate between 200,000 and 500,000 boys were taken through the Devsham system. Let that number sink in. 500,000 children stolen from their families. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Each stolen child represented a family destroyed, a community weakened, a culture under assault. The selection criteria grew more sophisticated over time. Boys needed to be unmarried, physically perfect, and preferably from rural areas. The conversion process was where the real psychological warfare began. First came isolation. Hers boys were immediately separated from anyone who spoke their language. Then came re-education, Islamic instruction, Turkish language immersion, military training. The old identity had to be completely erased. They were given new names, forbidden to speak their native languages, punished for showing any attachment to their past. But here's the genius of the system. They weren't just breaking these boys down, they were building them up into elite warriors and administrators. The Janissary Corps, created from these stolen children, became the most feared military unit in the world. Modern parents panic when their kids spend too much time on TikTok, worried about its influence. These parents watch their children get literally reprogrammed into weapons against their own people. Today we worry about college admissions and SAT scores. These parents were deliberately breaking their children's bones to make them unfit for selection. One common practice was to cut off a finger or toe. Better a maimed child at home than a perfect one stolen forever. Some parents would blind their sons in one eye, others would deliberately deafen them. The lengths parents went to save their children tell you everything about how horrific the Devsham was. But the Devsham system was just the beginning. Because while the Ottomans were perfecting child theft, other Islamic empires were turning human destruction into an actual industry. What happened to adult male slaves makes the Devsh look almost humane by comparison. Almost because when you're dealing with a practice that had a 90% mortality rate, humane isn't really in the vocabulary. If you thought stealing children was the worst of it, let me introduce you to a mathematical equation that would make genocide look inefficient. We're about to dive into something so disturbing that most historians won't even touch it. 90% mortality rate. Let that percentage roll around in your head for a second. That's not a battle statistic from some ancient war. That's the death rate for a medical procedure performed on hundreds of thousands of men and boys. We're talking about an industry that operated for over a millennium with actual business models built around the assumption that 9 out of 10 victims would die. And the most disturbing part, they kept detailed business records, spreadsheets of suffering, you might say. The Aswan Operations Center in Egypt was the Amazon fulfillment center of human mutilation, located at the first cataract of the Nile. This wasn't some back alley operation. This was an industrial facility processing 3,000 to 5,000 victims annually. The Coptic Christians ran the operation because apparently religious law had loos you could drive a caravan through. The methods used, well, let's just say they were designed for efficiency, not survival. Without going into graphic details that would get this video banned, imagine the crudest possible approach to ensure the victim could never father children. Now imagine that being done with tools that belonged in a medieval blacksmith shop, not an operating room. Here's what most people don't realize. Archaeologists have found the evidence. Mass burial sites near these centers filled with the bones of boys and young men. No names, no markers, just pits full of those who didn't survive the procedure. The skeletal remains show ages ranging from 7 to 25, with the majority being between 10 and 16. These weren't soldiers who died in battle. These were children who were mutilated for profit. Let me tell you about Jan, later known as the Prague Eunuch, though that wasn't the name his mother gave him. Captured at age 14 during a raid into Bohemia, he was marched over 1,000 miles to Cairo. He survived what most didn't, both the journey and the procedure. His memoir, written 40 years later when he'd risen to become a palace administrator, describes watching 30 boys die in the recovery room where he spent 3 months healing. His exact words, "It was a factory of death where angels were manufactured through subtraction," even decades later, writing from a position of power and comfort. The trauma bleeds through every word. The Ethiopian pipeline was another horror show that operated with mechanical efficiency. Annual raiding parties would sweep through villages, specifically targeting boys between 8 and 14. Why that age? They were old enough to survive the march, but young enough to be moldable. The march from Ethiopia to the castration centers in Cairo or Damascus wasn't just transportation. It was the first filter. If you couldn't survive walking across the desert in chains, you definitely wouldn't survive what came next. Pre-castration mortality rate 30 to 40%. That's before the actual procedure. But wait, it gets worse. Of those who made it to the castration centers, 90% died during or immediately after the procedure. So let's do the disgusting math here. Start with 1,000 captured boys, 300 to 400 die on the march. Of the 600 to 700 who reach the center, only 60 to 70 survive the procedure. Total survival rate 6 to 7%. In modern terms, that's a 93 to 94% mortality rate from capture to recovery. Makes even the worst medical malpractice cases today look like stunning successes. The economic records from Damascus are the kind of historical documents that make you question humanity. Actual price lists like some kind of ancient eBay for human misery. An intact slave boy, Cinci de dinari. The same boy after successful castration, 150 to 200 dinars. The math is simple and horrifying. Despite the 90% death rate, the profit margins made it worthwhile. They actually had insurance policies on slave caravans with different rates depending on whether the slaves were intact or castrated. The insurance documents list inventory loss as a standard business expense. One Damascus merchant's ledger from 1298 reads like a profit and loss statement from hell. Purchased 100 Nubian boys at average 45 dinars each. Transportation cost 500 dinars. Castration procedures 200 dinars. Lost 91 to the procedure. Sold 9 survivors at average 175 dinars each. Net profit 275 dinars. He's calculating profit margins on dead children like they're spoiled produce. The banality of evil doesn't get much more banal than this. Why castration? The practice served multiple purposes in this twisted system. First, it prevented reproduction. Can't have your slaves creating new generations who might remember freedom. Second, it created total dependency. Eunuchs couldn't form families, couldn't create dynastic threats, had nowhere to go except their master's household. Third, it was about control, both physical and psychological. A man who's been mutilated in the most intimate way possible is a man who's been utterly broken. But here's the really sick part. Eunuchs were considered safe around women, making them valuable for her supervision. So the very mutilation that destroyed their humanity made them economically valuable. The market demand was insatiable. Harems needed supervisors. Palaces needed administrators who couldn't create competing dynasties. Even mosques employed eunuchs. The geographic distribution of castration centers tells the story. Cairo, Damascus, Basra, Samarkand, Cordoba. Wherever Islamic empires expanded, the castration industry followed. It was as essential to the imperial economy as taxation or trade. The scale is staggering. Historians estimate 5 to 8 million men and boys were subjected to this procedure over the centuries. At a 90% mortality rate, we're talking about 4.5 to 7.2 million deaths. That's a Holocaust-level death toll spread over a millennium, completely memory-holed from history. The medical knowledge existed to make the procedure safer. Byzantine and Persian physicians had developed techniques with much higher survival rates. But here's the truly disturbing part. The crude methods were often deliberate. High mortality rates made survivors more valuable. It was supply and demand at its most inhuman. Some historians argue the operators could have achieved 50 to 60% survival rates with minimal changes. They chose not to. Dead boys were a business expense. Living eunuchs were a premium product. The religious loopholes that allowed this are a masterclass in hypocrisy. Islamic law technically forbade castration. Solution: have Christians and Jews perform the procedures. Islamic law forbade enslaving Muslims. Solution: castrate them first, then convert them. The legal gymnastics required to justify this industry would be almost impressive if they weren't so horrifying. Medieval Islamic jurists wrote entire treatises on why this was technically acceptable. Reading them is like reading corporate lawyers justify dumping toxic waste, except the toxic waste was human lives. We debate medical ethics today over informed consent and patient autonomy. These operations had a 90% death rate, and that was considered an acceptable business loss. Modern surgery has 99.9% survival rates for even complex procedures. And we still call 1 death in 1,000 a tragedy. These people viewed 9 deaths in 10 as the cost of doing business. Makes you appreciate that boring medical consent form a little more, doesn't it? But why did they need so many eunuchs? That brings us to the slave trade that dwarfed the Atlantic crossing by 1,000 years. Because while European slavery was primarily about agricultural labor, this system had much darker purposes. The numbers alone will stun you, but the reasons behind those numbers. That's where this historical nightmare reaches depths you didn't know existed. History classes teach you about 400 years of Atlantic slavery. They show you the triangle trade, the Middle Passage, the plantations. What they conveniently forget to mention is the slave trade that lasted 1,400 years. Not 400, 1,400. From the 7th century to the 20th. While your ancestors were still figuring out agriculture, this trade was already centuries old. When it finally ended, humans had walked on the moon. 11 to 17 million Africans enslaved. Not transported, enslaved. Because unlike the Atlantic trade, where descendants of slaves built new cultures and communities, most victims of this trade never survived long enough to have descendants. This isn't ancient history. It officially ended in 1962. Yes, 1962, the same year the Beatles released Love Me Do. Slaves were still being sold in Saudi Arabia. And unlike what you learned in school, this wasn't about labor. It was about something far more disturbing. The Zand Rebellion of 869 CE gives us some of the only first-hand testimony from victims of this system. 500,000 African slaves working in the salt marshes of southern Iraq rose up in one of history's largest slave revolts. But here's what most people don't realize. These weren't agricultural workers in the traditional sense. They were literally digging salt from poisoned earth, drinking contaminated water, living in conditions that made plantation slavery look like luxury. The testimonies that survive are almost too horrible to believe. One escaped slave described how they were fed one handful of flour daily, how the salt ate through their skin, how dead bodies were left where they fell, because moving them took energy better spent digging. The revolt lasted 14 years. Think about that. 500,000 people fought for 14 years, and you've probably never heard of it. Why? Because they lost. And when they lost, the historical records were sanitized. But archaeologists found the evidence anyway. Mass graves containing hundreds of thousands of bodies. The skeletal remains show signs of severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, and salt erosion of bones. The average age at death, 22 years old. The survival rate in those marshes was 2 to 3 years from arrival. These people were worked to death as efficiently as any Nazi labor camp, except it happened for centuries, not years. The Trans-Sahara trade routes were highways of death that make the Middle Passage look like a cruise ship. 20 documented routes crossing the largest desert on Earth. We're not talking about camel caravans with water and supplies. We're talking about human beings forced to walk across thousands of miles of desert in chains. The death rate during crossing averaged 80%. 4 out of 5 didn't make it. But wait, it gets worse. Modern archaeologists using satellite imaging have found the evidence. Chains of skeletons along the ancient trade routes still wearing iron shackles. Waterholes surrounded by human remains. Massacre sites where slaves too weak to continue were killed rather than abandoned. One site in the Libyan desert contained over 800 bodies, all showing signs of violent death. These weren't people who died of thirst. These were people murdered because they couldn't keep up the pace. Ottoman records actually list acceptable losses for different routes. The Chad to Tripoli route, 85% expected mortality. The Darour to Cairo route, 75%. They calculated death rates like shipping insurance. The Zanzibar slave market operated until 1873, and we have European visitor accounts that will turn your stomach. 50,000 slaves sold annually through a single market. David Livingstone, the explorer, described what he saw. To overdraw its evils is a simple impossibility. The sights I have seen, though common incidents of the traffic, are so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. This is a man who explored unmapped Africa, who faced lions and diseases, saying the slave market was too horrible to remember. The age distribution tells its own horror story. 70% of slaves were under 18. The gender ratio, 2 females for every male. Why? Because unlike Atlantic slavery, which needed strong backs for labor, this system had different uses for human beings. Young boys for castration and military slavery. Young girls for, well, we'll get to that particular nightmare soon. The end destination documentation shows most males went to military service or died in the castration process. Most females went to harems or domestic service. Domestic service being a euphemism that hides horrors we'll address later. The Nubian tribute system might be the most cold-blooded arrangement in human history. For 600 years, Nubian Christian kingdoms paid an annual tribute of 400 slaves to Muslim Egypt. 400 humans every year for 6 centuries. That's 240,000 people turned over as human taxation. The selection process in villages was mechanically cruel. Officials would arrive, select the required number from the population, and leave. Families torn apart, communities destroyed, all as regular as harvest season. Imagine your town having to provide 400 young people every year to avoid invasion. How long before your civilization collapses? Archaeological evidence shows exactly how long Nubian Christian civilization, which had thrived for 1,000 years, was extinct by the 15th century. Not conquered, not converted, extinct. Entire cities abandoned. Churches that had stood for centuries left empty. Languages that had been spoken since before Rome fell, silenced forever. All because of attacks paid in human lives. Modern demographic studies show the population collapse was so severe that entire regions of Nubia remained uninhabited for centuries. The scale comparison with Atlantic slavery reveals the hidden Holocaust. Atlantic slavery, 400 years, 12 million transported, 10 to 15% mortality during passage. Islamic slavery, 1,400 years, 11 to 17 million enslaved, 80% mortality during transport. But here's the key difference that explains why you know about one and not the other. Atlantic slavery, for all its horrors, left 42 million descendants in the Americas today. Islamic slavery, virtually no descendants. Where are the 17 million Africans who were enslaved? Where are their children, their grandchildren? They don't exist. The reason is simple and horrifying. This system wasn't designed for labor that could build families and communities. Males were castrated or worked to death. Females were absorbed into her, where their children, if they survived childbirth, were often killed or raised as slaves themselves. There was no emergence of new cultures, no communities of descendants to tell their stories, no museums or memorials because there's no one left to remember. It's a genocide so complete that it erased its own memory. We have heritage months and museums for 400 years of Atlantic slavery, as we should. That history is preserved, studied, remembered. The descendants of slaves became presidents and poets, scientists and soldiers. They built jazz and hip-hop, changed literature and politics. This 1,400-year Holocaust has no museums, no remembrance, no descendants to demand recognition. Because unlike plantation slavery, where humans were livestock to be bred, this system consumed humans like fuel. Use them up, throw them away, get more. The modern contrast is stark. We have international laws against human trafficking, UN resolutions, Interpol task forces. This was human trafficking as official state policy for over a millennium. Actual government departments managing the slave trade, tax revenues calculated on human sales, military campaigns specifically designed to capture slaves. The bureaucracy of bondage was as organized as any modern government department. They had quality standards, transportation regulations, market inspections. The paperwork survives in archives from Istanbul to Cairo, forms for slave purchases, receipts for human beings. The banality of evil filed in triplicate. But human trafficking was just one tool in the toolkit of cultural annihilation. The real genius, if you can call systematic evil genius, was in the economic warfare that made resistance mathematically impossible. Because why waste energy conquering people when you can make them destroy themselves? The Giza and Karag tax system was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty that would make modern economic hitmen look like amateurs. Forget military conquest. Forget dramatic battles and heroic last stands. The real weapon was mathematics, a formula that guaranteed poverty so crushing that survival itself became submission. The Giza and Karag taxes weren't about revenue. Think about that for a second. These weren't taxes designed to fund the government. They were precision instruments of cultural destruction calculated to break people without firing a shot. 50 to 80% of everything you grew every year for centuries. Not 50% of your profit, 50 to 80% of your total harvest. Imagine working all year knowing most of your harvest would be seized and you still had to pay additional tax while being physically humiliated. Modern tax protesters complaining about 30% rates would literally die under this system, and that was the point. Let's look at the Egyptian Coptic farm records from 950 CE, because nothing illustrates systematic oppression quite like actual accounting documents. A typical Coptic Christian farming family harvest of 100 units of grain. Karag taxed 70 units taken by tax collectors. That leaves 30 units for a family of 8 to survive an entire year. But wait, it gets worse. Those 30 units, they also need to save seed for next year's planting. So really, they have maybe 20 units of food for 8 people for 12 months. The children's deaths from malnutrition were documented by the tax collectors themselves. Not out of compassion, but because dead children meant fewer future taxpayers. One tax register notes, 3 children of Bros, the farmer, died this winter. Expected tax revenue reduced by future projections. They're calculating the fiscal impact of starved children like a spreadsheet error. The truly disturbing part, this family was considered lucky. They only lost 3 children. Their neighbors lost 5. The eldest son of this family, facing the mathematical certainty of watching his younger siblings starve, made the only rational choice available. He converted to Islam. Immediately, the family's tax burden dropped from 70% to 25%. The harvest that couldn't feed 8 people suddenly became survivable. His conversions saved his siblings' lives. But here's the really twisted part. He could no longer inherit the family land. Under Islamic law, he couldn't inherit from his Christian parents. So he saved his siblings by ensuring the family farm would be sold to Muslims when his parents died. Survival today, extinction tomorrow. The mathematics of cultural genocide. The Damascus Jesus ceremony was psychological warfare perfected over centuries. Every year, Christian and Jewish men had to pay the religious tax in a public ceremony designed for maximum humiliation. You didn't just pay, you performed your own degradation. The taxpayer would approach on his knees. The tax collector would strike him on the neck while declaring him subjugated. The blow was symbolic, but the message was clear. You exist at our pleasure. Some men would practice being struck beforehand so they wouldn't cry out in front of their children. Imagine the conversation. Don't worry, son. When you're older, you'll get hit too. One Damascus Christian wrote in his diary, "Today I paid the jizya for the 23rd time. My son watched for the first time. I saw in his eyes the moment he decided to convert. I cannot blame him." This wasn't just about money. It was about breaking spirits in front of the next generation, making fathers look weak in front of their sons, making men perform their own humiliation while their families watched the psychological damage passed down through generations like he inherited disease. The Armenian village of Kebed provides a case study in mathematical extermination. In 1562, the regional governor increased taxes to 90% of production. Not a typo, 90%. The village leaders protested, pointing out the obvious. This was a death sentence. The governor's response, then die or convert. When the village attempted resistance, gathering weapons and blocking tax collectors, the response was swift and brutal. Ottoman records list the punishment: every 10th man executed, taxes increased to 95% for 5 years, all weapons confiscated, and children taken for devshirm as punishment. The population records tell the rest of the story. 1,500 inhabitants. 1,550 inhabitants, and 90% population reduction in 5 years. Where did they go? Some converted and moved to Muslim districts. Some fled to the mountains to live as bandits. Most died. The cemetery records show the progression. First the elderly, then the children, then women, finally the men. Starvation follows a predictable pattern. The Ottoman tax records note the village was no longer productive by 1566. They'd extracted every bit of value, then moved on to the next village. Rinse and repeat across the empire. The Andalusian Jewish community's destruction shows how the economic weapon evolved over time. From 711 to 1066 CE, we can track the progressive tax increases through their own financial records. Year 1, 35% tax rate, sustainable if difficult. Year 50, 45% rate plus restrictions on business ownership, challenging but survivable. Year 100, 55% rate, banned from most profitable trades, families starting to convert. Year 200, 70% rate, property confiscations beginning, mass conversions. Year 300, 85% rate, cannot own land, restricted to specific neighborhoods, community in collapse. Year 355, massacre of remaining population, survivors expelled. The truly insidious part, this took centuries. No single generation faced the full transformation from prosperous community to extinct civilization. Each generation faced just slightly worse conditions than their parents. The proverbial frog in slowly boiling water, except the frog was entire civilizations, and the water was economic strangulation. The mathematical impossibility of advancement was built into the system. Let's say you're a Christian craftsman, you make beautiful pottery. Under the tax system, you pay 60% of your income in various taxes. Your Muslim competitor pays 10%. You need to charge higher prices just to survive. Customers buy from him instead. You can't save money to expand. You can't invest in better tools. You can't hire apprentices. Your son watches you work twice as hard for half the reward. What lesson does he learn? The only way to succeed is to abandon your faith. The tax system wasn't collecting revenue. It was purchasing conversions. Inheritance laws added another layer to the extinction formula. A Christian's wealth was taxed at death. If his son converted to Islam, the son couldn't inherit. If he didn't convert, the inheritance taxes often consumed the entire state. Either way, generational wealth accumulation was impossible. Muslim families could build wealth over centuries. Christian and Jewish families reset to zero every generation. It's compound interest in reverse. Instead of wealth growing exponentially, it disappeared exponentially. Additional taxes piled on like weights designed to break backs. Military exemption tax. Pay extra for the privilege of not serving in armies that would attack your own people. Road use tax. Pay to travel between towns. Market tax. Pay extra to sell your goods. Church repair tax. Pay for permission to fix your own place of worship. Water tax, bridge tax, gate tax, death by 1,000 cuts, except each cut was calculated to bleed you slowly, not kill you quickly. Dead people don't pay taxes. Desperate people do anything to survive. We complain about 20 to 30% income tax rates today. We protest, vote, sometimes even revolt over tax increases of a few percentage points. These people faced 80% taxation plus systematic humiliation. The mathematical certainty of generational poverty wasn't a side effect. It was the intended outcome. Modern economic warfare looks subtle compared to this. The IMF demanding structural adjustments seems almost kind next to tax rates designed to cause starvation. But taking their wealth was just the appetizer. The main course was erasing their entire civilization, because money, after all, is just a tool. The real target was memory itself. How do you delete a civilization so thoroughly that future generations don't even know it existed? That's where our story takes its darkest turn yet. When we say lost civilizations, we imagine natural disasters or mysterious disappearances, Atlantis sinking beneath the waves, the Maya abandoning their cities. But what if I told you some civilizations were deliberately deleted, not conquered and absorbed, not transformed or evolved, deleted, like highlighting text and hitting backspace? Languages spoken since the pyramids were built, gone. Religions practiced for millennia, erased. Entire cultures systematically removed from existence. This wasn't collateral damage from war or the natural flow of history. This was policy, and they were so thorough that most people today don't even know these civilizations existed. That's not accident. That's successful genocide. The Zoroastrian extinction event reads like a masterclass in cultural annihilation. For over 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism was one of the world's dominant religions. The Persian Empire's official faith, millions of followers from India to the Mediterranean. Sacred fire temples that had burned continuously since before Alexander the Great. Then came the Arab conquest of Persia, and with it a systematic program of erasure that would make modern ethnic cleansing look amateur. The fire temples were the first targets. These weren't just churches. They were libraries, schools, community centers, the heart of Zoroastrian civilization. The sacred fires, some burning for over a millennium, were extinguished, not accidentally during battle, deliberately, ritually. The priests were forced to watch as invaders poured water on flames their ancestors had tended for 50 generations. Then those priests were given a choice: convert or die. The execution records from just one decade show 40,000 Zoroastrian priests killed. That's not soldiers, that's clergy. Imagine if someone systematically executed every priest, minister, rabbi, and imam in America. That's the scale we're talking about. Sacred texts burned publicly in city squares. The Avesta, the Zoroastrian holy book, existed in millions of copies across the Persian Empire. Today we have fragments. The systematic destruction was so complete that modern Zoroastrians have to reconstruct their own religious texts from scattered surviving pieces. Imagine if Christianity had to piece together the Bible from a few scattered verses that survived book burnings. That's what remained of a 1,000-year-old religious tradition. The conversion of fire temples to mosques wasn't just practical reuse of buildings. It was symbolic domination. The holiest sites of Zoroastrianism became mosques. Believers had to watch their sacred spaces become centers of the religion that destroyed theirs. Some fire temples were demolished stone by stone, the materials used to build mosques. Others were converted intact, forcing Zoroastrians to see their holy places transformed daily. The psychological warfare was exquisite in its cruelty. The survivors who refused to convert fled to India, becoming the Parsee community, From millions to thousands, scattered refugees carrying what remained of their civilization in memory and hidden texts. Today, there are fewer Zoroastrians worldwide than there are people in a small city. A religion that shaped Persian civilization for over a millennium, reduced to an endangered minority. That's not natural cultural evolution. That's successful extermination. But the Zoroastrian genocide was just practice. Mahmud of Ghazni turned temple destruction into an industry. Between 1000 and 1027 CE, his armies destroyed an estimated 50,000 temples across northern India. Not damaged in battle, destroyed methodically, systematically. His own court historians, writing to glorify him, documented the process in detail that would make Nazi record keepers proud. The Somnath temple alone contained wealth accumulated over centuries. Gold idols melted down into coins, silver ornaments shipped back to Ghazni, the famous temple doors, masterpieces of Hindu artistry, taken as trophies. But here's the truly twisted part. The main idol was broken into pieces and embedded in the steps of Ghazni's mosque. Every Muslim entering the mosque would step on the Hindu god. The message wasn't subtle. Your gods are beneath our feet. The gold from Somnath alone was worth an estimated $80 billion in modern currency. This wasn't just cultural destruction. It was cultural destruction that paid for itself. Mathura, the birthplace of Krishna, received special attention. The city's temples weren't just destroyed, they were erased. Archaeological excavations show layers of destruction so complete that modern archaeologists struggle to reconstruct what existed. One inscription found in the ruins written by a Hindu priest as the destruction began reads, "The screams of stone as our gods die echo in my ears. Tomorrow this city of temples will be a memory. May someone someday remember." We only know this inscription exists because it was buried under rubble and discovered 900 years later. Thayazar massacre shows how cultural destruction accompanied physical extermination. 200,000 people killed according to Mahmud's own historians. But the death toll only tells part of the story. Thea was a center of Hindu learning. Thousands of manuscripts destroyed. Scholars executed with their students. An entire tradition of knowledge that stretched back centuries ended in days. The survivors scattered, taking what knowledge they could carry. How much was lost? We'll never know. That's the point of successful cultural genocide. You don't even know what you've lost. The death of Coptic is perhaps the most complete linguistic extinction in history. This wasn't some minor dialect. Coptic was the last stage of the Egyptian language, the direct descendant of the language of the pyramids. Hieroglyphs evolved into alphabet, a 5,000-year continuous linguistic tradition. Gone. The stages of extinction were methodical. First, Arabic became the language of administration. Coptic speakers couldn't function in government without Arabic. Then commerce. Can't trade without Arabic. Then public spaces. Speaking Coptic in markets became suspicious, then dangerous, then illegal. The language retreated into homes and churches. Families spoke Coptic privately, while children learned Arabic for survival. But children naturally spoke the language that gave them opportunities. Within generations, Coptic became the language of grandparents, then of prayers, then of no one. The last native Coptic speaker died in the 17th century. The language that had recorded the construction of the pyramids died with an old woman in an Egyptian village, taking with her words that had existed since before the Bronze Age. Modern Copts still use Coptic in religious services, the way European Catholics use Latin. But it's a dead language, pronounced by guesswork, understood by few. The grammatical subtleties, the poetry, the jokes, the lullabies mothers sang to babies, all gone. When hieroglyphics were finally deciphered in the 19th century, scholars had to work backwards from Greek and Arabic because Coptic, which would have been the key, was extinct. We can read ancient Egyptian tomb inscriptions, but we've lost the living language that evolved from them. That's what successful linguistic genocide looks like. Buddhist civilization in Central Asia faced complete erasure. Nanda University, the Oxford of the ancient world, burned for months when invaders destroyed it in 1193 CE. 9 million books. 9 million. The library was so vast that it burned for 6 months. Monks were burned alive with the manuscripts they tried to save. The archaeological evidence shows layers of ash feet deep mixed with human remains. Scholars who devoted their lives to preserving knowledge died with the books they protected. The numbers are staggering. Bihar alone had dozens of major monasteries, each with thousands of monks. By 1200 CE, zero, not reduced, zero. Afghanistan was a Buddhist kingdom for 1,000 years. Today, the only evidence is the destroyed Bamiyan Buddhas in archaeological ruins. The Buddhist population in these regions went from millions to nothing. Where did they go? Some fled to Tibet and East Asia. Some converted. Most died. An entire religious civilization that had thrived for over a millennium vanished so completely that most people don't even know it existed. We panic about digital data loss, about hard drives failing and clouds disappearing. These civilizations lost everything: language, religion, history, art, literature, philosophy, science. Imagine if English vanished tomorrow, not just as a spoken language, but all books in English burned, all records destroyed, the alphabet itself forbidden. Imagine if Christianity, Judaism, and secular Western culture was systematically erased, churches and synagogues demolished or converted, the Bible and Torah burned, priests and rabbis executed. Imagine if every university was destroyed, every library burned, every scholar killed. That's not imagination for millions of people. That's history. But they saved the worst systematic abuse for the most vulnerable population of all. Because everything we've covered so far, the slavery, the economic destruction, the cultural genocide, at least had some twisted military or economic logic. What happened to women under this system was pure systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. And the numbers will make your blood run cold. Everything we've covered so far had military or economic logic. Twisted evil logic, but logic nonetheless. Stealing children created soldiers. Castration created administrators. Economic oppression funded empires. This final system was pure, systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. 1.5 million women. That's not a total population figure. That's the Ottoman Empire alone.